And I think the subject matter, the way the questions were answered, really kind of confirmed. I think for myself, and I don't want to speak for you in this, but I think some pre-existing concerns about the nature of the games market currently, and the way in which we constantly see a flood of new titles
Yeah.
every year. And I know, there's sort of the notion that comes along with that it's this flood of poor quality titles, or quality control doesn't exist. And I think that's something that we kind of set as a defense mechanism to cope with the idea that there are legitimately very, very good games that are coming to these platforms every year that aren't really being played, that don't necessarily reach the same heights as games of equal or even lesser quality. So getting to hear people talk about that market saturation and really what their approach is to overcoming it is incredible. I think there is the benefit of not necessarily having a big publisher or a huge company kind of lurking over you, in that you can kind of shift your focus to the artistic integrity and intent of what you're creating. So while, of course, if you want to make games long term, you have to consider your revenue. There is the benefit of being able to kind of compartmentalize how you view success for your title. So there were a lot of kind of very diverse responses to how to engage with such a flooded market, and that, I think, was probably my favorite part of the discussions we had.
Yeah, and like some in particular that stood out to me was people really focusing, and I know, and this is even come up in some of our past guests and conversations with them as topics, but being very on the forefront of focusing on design, and design being kind of like a marketing element and really standing out. We had a couple of people we talked to that said that that's kind of a focal point for them, and not just from a marketing perspective, but also there is a big part of inspiration and a key component to what represents their studio or their outlook and the design and the whole process of making the game too. So it was really kind of interesting to see how marketing played into that, but how is also a driver and source of inspiration for these teams as well. But and that was clearly a big thing too, because obviously the design is something that you need to really stand out, and then standing out obviously was a very common theme that we heard, and just everybody's approach to that was a little bit different. Some people, their way of standing out was simply going to events like PAX and others. Other people was more standing out was, like I just said, the design. Other people were really focused on just trying to get their name out there any way that they could. So whether it was through organic efforts or other forms of advertising or going to events, like everybody had their different approach in terms of what they needed to do to stand out. But the important aspect was that they realized that they had to stand out. And because it even came up, like you were saying before, we had some people mention, like, hey, and I know it's been like this in the past, but people are like, oh, low quality games. It was the barrier entry is far lower. But as you said, and as some of our the people that we interviewed said too, is like, well, yeah, well, there is that low quality games, but there's also a lot more high quality games, and that's definitely more apparent a lot on a lot of these individuals' minds. Some other things that came up too that I thought was pretty interesting as well. One I thought was, I think it was Brett from Bullcut Studios mentioned retention that when you interviewed him, and that was an interesting one too, because a lot of people don't think about retention being a big aspect of marketing. It's more of like, hey, get your name out there and everything. But retentions and engaging and keeping your community engaged is definitely important too. Yeah. So I thought that was a key, interesting one as well. And then I'm trying to think of what else really got there. Oh, another big one too, which I think sometimes devs can get caught up with what they're doing, making the game, and obviously so, but and then just being aware of marketing, but while being aware of it, also like doing things to help mitigate that process. So and potentially hiring someone else to for marketing, whether it's working with a publisher or working with someone who has marketing experience. I know that's one thing that we kind of do on our end, but there's a lot of other individuals out there and people and companies that can help with those things. And just simply being aware of those people can make a huge difference, because at the very least, those individuals can help out educate you. And it seems like the individuals that we spoke with that were aware of that were definitely leveraging services like that, because then they could do their own thing and just really focus on making the game and having other people guide them through that process where they might not know that much about it. They probably have a basic understanding, but having that is going to be much more helpful and beneficial to them, not only on the marketing side of things, but obviously so they could focus more on the game development, and that's really where they need to be too.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think too often people think, well, I'm doing this independently, that means I have to do it by myself. Like, no, it means that you don't necessarily have as much oversight, but it doesn't mean that you have to go out and learn every single facet of what makes a quality game. People outsource assets, right? If you don't have the artistic know-how to be able to create an aesthetically pleasing 3D visual, you're probably going to turn to somebody who does. So why wouldn't that be the same way with some of the more business-focused elements of game development? Like, it is all tied together if your goal is to sell copies of your game.
Right.
Which, even if your goals are rooted in your vision, I would say the two are intertwined. There is kind of like a point where you have to look at it realistically. I think one thing that I really enjoyed, and kind of a common theme, I think, across any interview has been, when it comes to the idea of community, particularly with independent developers, a lot of the things that people view as disadvantages are really being leveraged to kind of give them avenues that larger companies might not have, particularly in a way of their ability to have kind of a boots on the ground approach and the ability to connect with audiences in a way that feels a lot more personal. I think the fact that we could, even at an event like this, walk up to any old person and I mean, not that we didn't schedule appointments and interviews and things like that, but the fact that we were able to walk up to the booth where the game was being shown and talk to, in some cases, 50% of the company, I think that there is a really strong benefit to that. It's not something that you're going to necessarily be able to do with a Nintendo, right? Or
right.
You can't just walk over there and talk to the director of a AAA title. It just doesn't really work that way. And I think, having that kind of one-to-one interaction opens doors for it opens doors ultimately to provide the game with an added layer of personality that it might not otherwise have.
Yeah, and that carries well beyond a showroom floor, an event like PAX too. That accessibility is great for just developers to have that to their fan base, and whether it's 5 or 500 or more, still having that accessibility to your fan base, it really speaks volumes compared to what we're seeing now, what's happening now, I think it just makes things more genuine, and also it just allows you to be a bigger part of something, this community that you essentially created from nothing, in terms of the developers and stuff. So I think you make a really good point there, because it's just really exciting to have that. And like you said, with big name publishers or other developers, I mean, that's not necessarily the case, and I think there's a huge advantage there to be able to accommodate that to your fan base and be a part of something. And it's, I mean, not to sound lame or anything, but it is something special to be able to have something like that. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, even like myself, coming out of, having studied game design and wanting to go into the field, like the fact that I was able to look at games that I enjoyed and connect with people who were responsible for them pretty easily, and ask questions and talk about process and things like that. Like that's incredible. I mean, you don't really get to have that in any sort of artistic medium otherwise. It's not like you can say, I want to be a screenwriter and go find the Russo brothers on Twitter. Like, it just doesn't work that way. It's really cool to be able to have that, and it's really cool that I think in games above any other creative medium, independent content creators of any kind really have a lot more of a reach than they otherwise would. And I think PAX and the conversations that we had were really very indicative of kind of the lasting impact that that's going to have. As much as the saturated market came up, I think as things continue on the path they're going on, I think it's going to become less and less of a problem, because ultimately trust in, big budget game titles isn't necessarily where it was, even a year ago.
Yeah.
A lot of these big companies, like some of the absences that I mentioned, were companies that were kind of under the gun and people were paying close negative attention to over the span of the last year.
Yeah.
And I think with there being such a volume of indie developers, you don't really encounter things like that on the same scale.
No. And speaking of the volume too, and just to kind of like finalize and wrap this up, I know we were talking about before as far as like, how people are standing up and everything. And I think it's worth noting too that at least out of a couple of the interviews and that we had, just to be mindful too that even if you are that solo developer out there and feel like that it is kind of difficult to do all these things or to work with people, a couple of the people we spoke with were really they had a hard time finding a publisher, and that was their main focus. And then they realized, well, how else are we going to do this if that doesn't work? So they found, and I'm sure a lot of people doing this, but but just being driven to do this is just really leveraging the indie community as well and communicating with others. And I know it's kind of a given, but still to do that is super helpful. Like, reach out to people who are, have a successful studio or whatever they deem as being successful is, but people that are doing it, that have been doing, that are doing full time and are sustainable, talking to those individuals and really networking and reaching out and never stopping at doing that, because that's going to be a big driving force for a lot of the people out there too. And so just even when you think that you have minimal resources, it really just comes down to what you limit yourself to do, and I felt that way too. Like, every one of these people were, I was so grateful to have them on the show, because I mean, outside of obviously getting some exposure and getting out there a little bit, their sole intent behind a lot of them really wanting to do these interviews, because there were some individuals that were nervous too, but the whole reason and drive behind this was simply, hey, look, we're part of a show, we're being on a show that's really standing up and helping out this great community, and so it was just really great to see them do that, and being kind of a sole reason to being on the show and having these interviews done.
Yeah, well put. Couldn't agree more.
Well, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to at least recap. I mean, it was another great year at PAX. I almost think I might be going a little off here, but because I'm sure not everybody would agree with me, but I almost think it's probably one of the best PAXs I've been to. Even though I didn't feel like I did a whole lot, but it still felt well organized, a great event, and I just really had a great time meeting all these different people and a bunch of others. How about yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I think like panel wise, I felt like I would have enjoyed a little bit more.
Yeah.
But as far as the show floor, I think it's probably at the very least one